Welcome, Stewart. And
Thank you.
Lisbon looks glorious, I have to say. So thank you for hosting this event. So, Stewart, for anyone that hasn't used Slack, there might be some people here that still haven't done it. We've got 9 million weekly active users, including NASA, Harvard, and eBay. But it's a richly featured chat tool. That probably is a very simplified way of describing it. But it's also very friendly, and it has a distinct personality. Why is it better than email, and why is it better than, say, Lotus Notes?
This is a very current reference. It's better than email because of the communication ending up in what we call channels. So a channel can correspond to a project, an office location, a team, some functional group like marketing. And instead of addressing messages to an individual or a group of individuals, you address them to the channel. The channel can exist whether you're a member or not, and you can see across the organization in a way that otherwise wouldn't be possible. So we sometimes say that Slack is team-first messaging, whereas email has the primacy on the individual, which is not a bad thing in the grand scheme of the world. But if you're trying to collaborate with a group of 8 or 80 or 800 people, being on the same page makes a big difference.
And describe this very particular personality that Slack has, because it encourages a certain sort of kind of dialogue, doesn't it?
Yeah. In one sense, you want both as individuals in the workplace to be professional and to bring one aspect of your life into the workplace, and you don't want the workplace invading all aspects of your life. But on the other hand, there's a disaffectation, I think, that people feel, partly because it's very typical to have the experience that I'm not able to contribute all that I can contribute. I'm not called upon. You don't bring your whole self to work. And one of the things that we try to keep in mind is that this is software that's used by human beings, and human beings communicating with other human beings, despite all of our excellence in other realms, is still pretty fraught. I do this exercise, and maybe I'll try it here, with new employees at Slack, where I ask them to put up their hands if they've ever treated someone they loved in a way that they later regretted. So maybe I should say that in a different way. Put up your hands if you've ever treated anyone you loved in a way that you later regretted. Either this is not translating into Portuguese, or we have a room full of psychopaths. And the point is there, if in your relationship with your spouse, with your parents, with your children, with your siblings, you're not able to communicate in the way that you want, then these people in the workplace, who almost by definition are going to matter to you less, those same challenges are going to arise. And if we can let people feel a little bit more human and relate to them in a way that isn't typical for enterprise software, the result we hope for is that they feel much more comfortable and are able to contribute in a way that they wouldn't otherwise be able to.
So that really quite nicely describes how Slack seems to represent a new way of working among technology companies, some technology companies, that's kind of led and informed by soft skills. And it's not just how Slack as a company is run and has been developed, but also the product itself. And you talked recently in an article about the problem of loneliness at work. So how does Slack help foster that kind of sense of belonging? Because some of that is through spontaneous kind of funny channels, sharing gifts and the like.
So yeah, that is the, so you said chat tool in the beginning, and we're forbidden from using the word chat internally.
I'm quite sure.
Oh yeah, because it makes it sound trivial. But at the same time, one of the first reactions that people have when they tell me they use Slack is to talk about all of the gifts that they share. And that might just seem like a frivolous waste of time, but there is a nuance to the communication when there's a larger palette than just language, and especially raw bits of text on the screen are much more subject to misinterpretation than spoken language is, because there's fewer social cues. So having things like emoji and GIFs as additional social context makes a big difference to people's ability to feel understood. But there, in particular, was one thing that we didn't expect, which we heard over and over again from people with a really similar message, which was, I'm very introverted, and I've never felt I was able to participate fully in work It takes me a little bit more time to formulate my thoughts, and the meetings tend to be really fast-paced, and some of the people in the room are quite aggressive. Now I'm able to contribute because that conversation doesn't just happen at one moment in a meeting room and then is forever closed. And I think people talk about neurodiversity. I think there's a more friendly tool or more capable tool for people with a wide range of individual inclinations.
Is it not possible that just as in a physical meeting room there would be some people that didn't feel empowered to speak up, that in Slack there might be some people who just didn't feel confident enough with their writing to
Absolutely. And then there's another one, which is, I mentioned the transparency. One of the big values is to have a question asked and then answered in public, because then the answer is available not just to the person who asked the question at the moment they asked it, but to everyone thereafter. And some of those answers show up, months or even years later when new people join and they're searching for the origin of some decision. But very few people feel comfortable initially asking questions in public because they don't want to admit that they don't know the answer. So there's a superficial first usage of Slack that in the best case gives way to a larger cultural change where the communication practices best suit the tool, and the tool sort of reinforces, hopefully, the better aspects of that cultural change.
The idea of such sort of radical transparency might be quite alarming to some CEOs, perhaps, who've been used to having slightly more of a hierarchical process in the company. But it's not just about transparency for the CEO's communication, is it? Can you talk to the transparency point?
Yeah, so people often use the word transparency to talk about or to mean that the bosses are forthcoming with the workers, so they're not lying to them. But there's another sense of transparency, which is just the literal, opposite of opacity, that people can see across the organization. And that's incredibly powerful because there are, and they tend to be middle managers more than executives, but there are some bad management practices at some companies where people use information hoarding as kind of as a means of exercising power. And Slack makes that more difficult. But in general, what the workers want and what the bosses want is almost exactly the same thing. And if you think about in US and British culture, there's the TV show The Office, the movie Office Space, Dilbert the cartoon, and I mentioned earlier the disaffection or alienation that people feel. And that's, a lot of it has to do with these decisions don't make sense to me. I don't have the context. This seems silly or redundant. And that increase in transparency makes a really big difference to people's sense of empowerment and autonomy and their ability to make decisions, and probably a reduction in cynicism. And that's certainly what individual, sometimes we say end users of Slack inside a company want, but also what the company itself wants. I mean, what the CEO wants, or any manager, is for people to have a greater sense of alignment, kind of shared consciousness, to be working in concert, because the difference in outcome for any company is, in my opinion anyway, much more driven by the performance at the team level than the individual. And very rarely, I've been making software for over 20 years, and very rarely have I ever seen someone fired because they weren't good at programming, or someone in finance who wasn't good at using Excel or something like that. It's rarely those basic skills that describe your role-specific function, but your ability to communicate with other human beings in the context of the workplace. And that it is manifested at an even higher level when you consider the whole organization. The companies that fail tend to have really dysfunctional cultures, and I think that failure is almost directly caused. It doesn't follow that every successful company has a very healthy culture, but most do.
So how do you convince organizations that are looking to take on Slack? It seems like quite a big shift in trusting the employees to communicate effectively with each other. How do you explain that to companies that seem resistant?
Well, the good news is mostly we don't have to. So you said 9 million weekly active users. There's hundreds of thousands of teams around the world. There's over 50,000 paid companies using Slack. And almost all of that was bottoms up. So we have a wonderful and very successful sales team, but almost all of the Slack usage inside of the companies that the sales team talks to came from someone inside the company. So very bottoms up. And what's interesting about that is there's certainly a population of people maybe more like me, and if you're here and you came to this conference, probably a little bit like you, where you have this naive, idealistic belief that software will somehow improve your ability to get your job done. But sometimes it actually works, right? And there are people who have this same frustration, which is a little bit hard to articulate, so I apologize that I can't express it exactly, but that our communication could be better. We could be wasting less time going back and forth on things. We could have a higher sense of alignment. We could ultimately trust each other a little bit more. Ben Horowitz is one of our investors, has this interesting point that in the workplace and probably everywhere else, the amount of communication required to accomplish some goal is inversely proportional to the amount of trust in the organization. So when trust goes up, the need for communication goes down, and certainly you can see this when there's distrust. There's a constant lawyering of points and asking for elaboration and getting people to be really clear. Whereas in a high-trust relationship, you can sometimes give people just a nod, and they understand exactly what you mean.
That's very interesting, when you probably have the data to see on the back end which companies have the best trust ratio among their staff. So there are these three particular values that seem to define Slack. Collaboration, identity, and empathy. Again, all soft skills. With collaboration, what is it about the design and the mechanics of Slack that kind of corral discussion and ideas in a positive and productive way?
Well, I think it goes back to the original point about channels. And email is very much like a to-do list that anyone in the world can add to. So I have my inbox. And I have a lot of people who I wish would not add items to my to-do list, adding items. But my view of the world through the inbox looks entirely different than yours, and looks entirely different from everyone out here. When everyone's looking at the same channel and you can trust that the same information is available to them, it's a pretty radical shift in knowing what other people know, and that definitely makes it much easier to collaborate. And almost all, even whatever you imagine when I say the person at the company who spends the least amount of time on internal communication. So in a technology company, I think the archetype is a back-end systems programmer who's antisocial and doesn't want to talk. They still spend a third of their time writing comments in their code, reading and responding to bug reports, talking to the product manager, talking to the quality assurance people, communicating with the other engineers on the team. And that's the average across the organization, given that managers and leaders are usually spend 100% of their time in communication, it might be 50 or 60%. So any leverage you can get on the efficacy of communication makes a really big difference.
And in terms of creativity, how does Slack encourage creativity, which is often reliant on sort of spontaneous moments of thought and inspiration, when it seems that the opposite actually is sort of very structured software?
It's a good question. There's definitely a relationship between constraint and creativity, and you see this in almost all of the creative arts. Poetry is definitely creative and almost defined by the set of constraints. So
the haiku.
Yeah, a haiku or a sonnet with a particular meter that has a rhyme scheme that has 4 quatrains and a couplet at the end. And same thing in music. You have a time signature, you have a key, you have a mode, and you can see over the course of the 20th century, playing with those constraints fed a lot of art. So blank verse poetry and free jazz and abstract expressionism. And I think there is a little bit of that interplay in the context of Slack, not because the tool itself is so rigid. I think the tool is actually very open. But as soon as you start defining what the channels are, you set up some constraints, you set up some structure, and then there's a creative interplay with people pushing back or accepting that structure.
In terms of identity, there is a whole generation entering the workforce now who is completely fluent in social media, and that is one of their first kind of, I don't like the expression digital native, but they are. And they're bringing that into workplace culture, and that's obviously a language that works very well on Slack. But is informality always appropriate at work? And has the idea of a kind of professional persona gone out of the window?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I'm old enough to remember life before the internet, and I think for those of you who do, we're probably in the last generation of human beings that will know life both before and after the internet, because I think it's going to be with us for another couple 100,000 or million years. And there is something very different about the construction of identity in a world where people are online, and almost all of your use of Instagram or Facebook or Snapchat or whatever is very much creating an identity that is external in the world, which is not something that people had or most people had in 1992 or 1973 or 1951. People expect to bring that with them, and they do to a certain extent. You have all kinds of interesting issues around examining someone's social media feeds in the context of them applying for a job. So some ability to create that persona inside the workplace is important. And going back to what I said earlier, the tension between bringing your whole self to work and maintaining that professionalism is something that I think we're still negotiating and probably still will be negotiating a decade or two from now.
Can you touch a little on introverts and maybe give some examples of how certain channels or conversations have developed and really benefited people who are less confident?
Well, just that piece of feedback that I mentioned earlier, it's an opportunity to formulate your thought, sometimes let it sit for a little while, and then contribute it asynchronously. So people think of Slack and other messaging apps as being necessarily synchronous, but certainly they're much less synchronous than a telephone call or an in-person meeting. And there is a possibility to contribute 5 minutes later, or 5 hours later, or 5 days later.
And empathy, as well as a company, as well as a product. There are some very popular channels often used on Slack that aren't really strictly about work, they're more socializing. Mm-hmm. But building that rapport with colleagues about something as, I don't know, asthma or your bicycle commute is really important. And so these kind of informal threads of communication do help sort of build more of a foundational bond, don't they? Yeah,
absolutely. And that's the reason that people do the trust exercises, which are so often made fun of at corporate offsites. Or probably my favorite is getting people to cook together. First of all, it's fun, but also unpacks the kind of degree of collaboration and communication that they are going to exhibit in the regular workplace. But getting to know people, and again, there is a really fine line here, getting to know people outside of the context of what they do at the company can be extremely important for developing some empathy for them inside the company. So, you can be much more forgiving when you understand what's motivating someone.
How many channels in your Slack program for Slack?
So Slack's a company of about 900 people, and I actually don't know the exact answer to that question, but it's definitely in the thousands, and it could be as high as 10,000 at this point.
10,000 Slack channels?
Yeah. So we tend to spin them up for really specific conversations, even if they're short term. So we didn't have one planning the trip to come to Lisbon. But that kind of thing can easily happen. We have, for every large customer, we have a channel. Often there's different channels for the same project for different functional groups. So engineering will have one, design will have one, product management will have one. But yeah, there are many.
What do you think is the biggest misnomer about Slack?
I think that it is chat. And I think people radically, so in one sense it is. In another sense, people radically underestimate the importance of communication to getting work done, because if there's certain things that you can do all by yourself. Most of them are artistic or crafts and things like that. Most ways that most people make money, require dealing with other people. And like I mentioned before, the difference in the outcome or the difference of the performance of the organization has to do not just with like the sum of all of the talent in the room, but their ability to work together. And I think it's something that's really, people give it like one checkbox. We have video calling, we have some platform for messaging, we're done, as opposed to focusing a lot more effort, energy, and attention in that area.
I think it's maybe 2 years since you last spoke at Web Summit. So if there are any entrepreneurs in the room who perhaps started using Slack next time and they need to kind of level up a bit, what advice would you give them?
We had a really transformative experience. So just between you and me and all of the cameras and stuff here, when Slack, the company, was about somewhere between 50 and 80 people, we wrote a memo internally called Slack is a Distracting Menace. And the reason for it was we had this way of working when we were 8 people, which is everything was public. Every decision was discussed, people asked for feedback, and they gave input on everything. And we did the same thing when we were 20 people, and we did the same thing when we were 40 people, and it started just getting exponentially harder for that to happen. And the canonical example was someone from our customer experience team who handles support tickets, getting a ticket from an engineer that says, from a customer that says, I did X and then Y happened, and that's something unexpected and unusual, and it's inexplicable, so they go to an engineer, and because we're using Slack, they go into an engineering channel and say, hey, customer says they did X and then Y happened. And then half the engineering team stops what they're doing and goes, that's weird, that shouldn't happen. And now they're looking in Jira to see if other people have reported bugs like this. They're looking through the original conversation. They're looking sometimes right at the code itself and stepping through it line by line. And then someone comes up with the answer and everyone else wasted their time. So we invented what we called triage channels. So for every part of the engineering organization, iOS, Android, desktop, search, we created a triage channel. One person was on duty each day to get those requests from the customer support team. And like the same day, it unblocked all of these other questions that marketing had for that team or that product managers had for that team. And within 2 weeks, the whole company had reorganized to expose interfaces, like internal interfaces to itself, with things like triage billing, triage benefits for HR questions, triage finance. And it was one of the biggest and most transformative moments for us in our own internal communication. So I guess the very long-winded advice is to spend a little bit of time on that channel structure and kind of the overall structure of communication inside the organization, because it pays off enormously.
That's a very good tip. Okay, I've got some quick-fire questions for you, 3 till we finish. What's your favorite emoji and why? So it's like choosing children, isn't it?
I can't say that, well, I mean, the poop emoji is my favorite in terms of like a spirit animal. But the most useful for us internally is a raccoon emoji. I have no idea why this happened, but when something goes off topic in a channel in Slack, we say that we're raccooning it to another channel, and people use the raccoon emoji. I have no idea what the origin of that was, but it's incredibly useful. Applied emojis.
Okay. What's been the biggest non-tech influence on your thinking? Or who, I should say, rather.
It's hard to know how pervasive this is, but the first thing that came to mind was Charles Eames, American designer, with his wife, Ray, did a whole bunch of incredible projects, but one thing that he said that really stuck with me is the role of a designer is that of a good host, so anticipating the needs of guests, and that's something that I think is very deep into our DNA on the design side.
And what would you like to be the legacy of Slack and how it has changed the future of work? In a nutshell.
Hopefully creating more of a space for that humanity and allowing people to elevate each other and perform at ever higher levels.
Dude, be good to each other.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Stewart.
Thank you.